So in this final presentation, we're going to be talking about communism, what that actually is, and how the Red Scare had an effect on communism and the United States. So first we have to ask ourselves what communism even is. And communism is defined as an economic and social system in which all or nearly all property and resources are collectively owned by a classless society and not by individual citizens. And it's also an economic ideology developed by Karl Marx and his associate Friedrich Engels. In a more layman's term, communism is this idea that there's no longer a low class, middle class, high class. It's all just one large group of people, and they own everything. There's no more private property, and there's no one higher up than anyone. There's no more corporations. And then we need to talk about the founders of this ideology, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Marx was born in 1818 and died in 1883, and he was a German philosopher, communist, and most famously a revolutionary socialist. And Engels was born in 1820, died in 1895, and he's also a German philosopher and a businessman that worked with Marx to develop Marxist communism. And together in 1848, they published the famous Communist Manifesto, which leads us to talk about the Communist Manifesto. Like I said, it was published in 1848, and in this manifesto, Marx and Engels outlined exactly what their philosophy was, and they also laid out a blueprint for how society can become one that is a communist one. And their ideas center on the idea that inequality and suffering result from capitalism, and under capitalism, private business people and corporations own all the factories, equipments, and other resources called the means of production. And these owners, according to the communist doctrine, can exploit workers who are forced to sell their labor for wages. So what we have to see here is that this definitely does stem a lot and can connect a lot to the modern day United States, where we are a capitalist society, where we do have business people and corporations who own the factory and the equipment and the resources, and you leave smaller people who have to sell their labor to make a profit for themselves. But they don't really make a profit. They don't have anything to do with the equipment or the resources that are being used. They have nothing to do with the means of production. And this working class of people are called the proletariat. And in the blueprint they lay out, they say that this proletariat must rise up against the capitalist owners, or the bourgeoisie, according to the ideals of communism, and institute a new society with no private property, no economic classes, and no profits. And in this, they go on to talk about how this is the only way that we're able to achieve this true communist society, is when people don't have private property anymore. There's no longer a low class, middle class, high class, and there's no more profits. It means the proletariat now has access and has seized the means of production. And the publication of this Communist Manifesto actually led to Marx being exiled from Germany for his radical ideas, and he fled to London and lived out the rest of his life there. And then, even though the Communist Manifesto was relatively clear in all its ideas and its blueprints, that still leads to a lot of misconceptions about what Marxist communism is. So the first misconception that people often have is that communism is violent, and this idea is predicated on the problems that happened in the Soviet Union and China and even Cambodia, where millions of people died because communism wasn't implemented correctly, and that's the only reason why people believe it's a violent idea, because these countries tried to implement a communist farming society, and it led to famines in the Soviet Union and China, and led to the leaders of the Cambodian Revolution to kill off anyone that wasn't an asset to the system. So people ended up dying because of that, and that's why people believe communism is a violent thing, even though it isn't necessarily that. It's actually very peaceful, outlined in the Communist Manifesto after the proletariat has seized the means of production, and there's no longer classes there, because no one is being exploited for labor anymore. The second misconception that people have about communism is that communism fosters uniformity, and this idea comes from the fact that there's no longer private property or economic classes anymore, so that must mean people are uniform. That isn't necessarily the case. There are many more dedicated Marxist communists that believe communism is able to foster more individuality because people are no longer being held by chains to the corporation anymore. And the third misconception that people have about communism is that it's against human nature and that's why it doesn't work. But we actually have to see here is that the reasons why it hasn't worked is because it hasn't been implemented right, not because it's against human nature. It's actually more against human culture. People are, by nature, a more herd kind of animal. They want to be with each other, and they don't want to necessarily fight with each other all the time. And it's more against human culture, especially Western culture, which is predicated on being successful and being above the other. It's a race to the top. And so communism is against human culture rather than against human nature. then that leads us to talk about the Red Scare of the 1950s. So as the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States intensified in the late 1940s and early 1950s, hysteria over the perceived threat posed by the communists in the United States became known as the Red Scare. And the Red Scare led to government employees having their loyalties to the United States under harsh scrutiny. We can often see this correlate with what happened right after 9/11, when there were government employees being accused of being terrorists as well. So it's really not necessarily cool, but a way that the Red Scare and ties into the modern times. And this period of time gave way to Senator Joseph McCarthy to rally around people with his anti-communist sentiment and form the House of an American Activities Committee. And what this house was is that government officials who were accused of being communists or being communist sympathizers would be brought before this committee to essentially stand trial and have to plead their loyalty to the United States and prove that they weren't communists. And thus, Joseph McCarthy formed this, what is now called McCarthyism. It's this practice of making accusations of subversion or treason without proper regard for evidence. And this essentially was a modern-day witch hunt, because during the Red Scare, thousands of people were being accused as communists or communist sympathizers. And because of this, people who were even accused of it lost their jobs because no one wanted to hire a potential communist or sympathizer. People lost their social status because no one wanted to associate with that kind of person. And some people even lost their lives because people who were considered to be communists or sympathizers were killed by people who were not. Because the scare was so real and so blown out of proportion at the time. And it actually was a modern day witch hunt because people would go around and accuse people that they didn't like of being communists just to essentially wreak havoc on their lives. And no one played that game better than Senator Joseph McCarthy. And during the later half of the 1950s, McCarthy began to accuse Army loyalty, and then that led to the Army McCarthy hearings that were aired for 36 days and attracted millions of viewers. And what happened in those hearings is that Senator Joseph McCarthy would accuse higher ups in the Army of being communists, and that actually led to the end of the Red Scare because people began to see that it was probably kind of weird that their own army, their own military was accused of being communist, so that Joseph McCarthy, while he fueled a lot of the Red Scare, actually was the reason of its demise. But there was massive long-lasting effects of the Red Scare, and the first is that it led to a large stigma against communism in the United States, because now you see the people who were alive during the 1950s and around the Red Scare and the Cold War thinking communism is the worst thing possible, where you have now this generation of millennials who thinks it's a lot better than their previous generations do. It also led to a massive violation of constitutional rights because oftentimes when someone was brought to trial about being a communist, they would plead the Fifth, and even just pleading their Fifth Amendment rights was enough to make people think that they actually were a communist or a sympathizer. It's also led to the deportation of innocent people because people who actually were accused of being enough of a communist would be deported away from their homes and away from their families, and it led to an increased nativist and intolerant sentiment because the native culture at the time was a capitalist one, and they became intolerant of communist ones. And because of this, it's actually led to a spike in new members of the Ku Klux Klan, because they had the same sentiments there. The Ku Klux Klan was a nativist, essentially Anglo-Saxon white male type of group that was intolerant towards people of color. And because these two correlated so well with each other, we saw a massive spike in that. So now you're all educated and you know more about what Marxist communism actually is, what effects and the misconceptions are of those, and how the Red Scare of the 1950s affects what communism is today.